Imagine this. It's the late 1800s in the misty Appalachian foothills of western North Carolina, where rugged settlers carve out lives from dense forests and rocky soil, relying on handed-down wisdom from their grandparents about how to build homes that can withstand the brutal mountain weather. But one man, Angus McLoud, a Scottish immigrant with a stubborn streak and a head full of unconventional ideas, decides to ignore all that traditional know-how and slaps wet clay right onto his cabin roof, prompting his neighbors to burst into laughter, calling it the most foolish thing they'd ever seen, whispering that poor Angus must have lost his mind during the harsh winter prior, because everyone knows clay is heavy, prone to cracking, and utterly useless against the relentless rains that sweep through these valleys like angry spirits. But hold on, because what if I told you that this foolish roof did just survive a drizzle or a storm? No, it held strong through an unimaginable 40 days of nonstop pouring rain that turned rivers into raging monsters. Like a cozy hearth in the dead of night, proving that sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that rewrite history and save lives. You see, back in March 1897, Angus wasn't just building a roof. He was challenging centuries of building practices that favored lightweight cedar shingles, which were easy to split from local trees and quick to install. But they had a fatal flaw: they absorbed water like sponges, swelling and splitting under prolonged moisture, leading to leaks that could ruin a family's entire winter stores of food and firewood. And Angus, having lost his own barn to a similar deluge the year before, spent sleepless nights pondering alternatives, drawing inspiration from ancient Roman and Spanish tile roofs he'd read about in a tattered book borrowed from the town library, where clay was baked into durable tiles that repelled water and insulated against both heat and cold. As the neighbors gathered at the general store, swapping stories over steaming coffee, they mocked Angus relentlessly, saying things like that clay'll slide right off in the first gust. Mark my words. Or he's wasting good earth that could fertilize his crops instead of piling it on his head like a madman. And even his wife, bless her patient soul, questioned him quietly in the evenings, wondering if they shouldn't stick to what worked for everyone else. But Angus pressed on, mixing local red clay with straw for strength, shaping it into curved tiles by hand, and firing them in a makeshift kiln he built from river stones, a process that took weeks of backbreaking labor under the scorching summer sun, all while the community shook their heads in pity. Little did they know, this wasn't just whimsy. Angus had studied the land, noticing how clay-rich soil in the hills shed water during spring thaws, staying firm while sandy areas washed away, and he figured if nature used clay to protect itself, why couldn't he harness that for his family, creating a roof that not only deflected rain but also trapped heat from the sun, turning his cabin into a natural oven that radiated warmth long after dark. As autumn turned to winter, the skies grew heavy, and whispers of an unusual weather pattern spurred old-timers recalling legends of biblical floods. But no one took it seriously until the first drops fell, and then they didn't stop, day after day, swelling creeks into torrents that swept away bridges and livestock, forcing families to huddle under leaking roofs that dripped incessantly, breeding mold and sickness, while Angus watched from his dry porch. But wait, the real test was just beginning. And what happened next would turn those mocks into pleas for help, as the rain hammered down without mercy for the 10th straight day, turning the once fertile valley into a muddy quagmire, where wagons sank to their axles and children couldn't play outside without risking fever from the chill. Angus McLoud's clay roof began to show its true genius, not cracking or leaking like the skeptics predicted, but instead forming a seamless barrier that channeled water away in neat rivulets, keeping the interior as snug as a burrow. And his neighbors, who had initially joked about his mud hat, started casting envious glances toward his cabin as their own homes turned into soggy nightmares, with water seeping through warped shingles, ruining quilts and spoiling grain sacks that were meant to last through spring. You have to understand the historical context here. In the late 19th century, Appalachian settlers were tough folks, descendants of Scottish immigrants who brought with them building techniques suited to milder European climates, like thatched or shingled roofs that worked fine for occasional showers but faltered in the face of prolonged Appalachian downpours, which could dump inches of rain in hours due to the mountains trapping moist air from the Gulf, creating what meteorologists later called orographic lift. But back then, it was just known as the Wrath of the Hills. And Angus, with his background in pottery from his father's trade back in Scotland, saw potential in the abundant clay deposits that dotted the region. Deposits formed from ancient weathered granite that provided a natural fire-resistant material far superior to wood for long-term durability. Informative as it is, this wasn't just about science. It was deeply emotional for Angus, who had buried a child the previous winter after a leaky roof led to pneumonia, a tragedy that haunted him and fueled his determination to innovate. Experimenting in secret with tile prototypes, testing them in buckets of water and under heavy weights to mimic snow loads, all while enduring the town's gossip that painted him as an eccentric fool who might bring bad luck to the community. As the days stretched to 20, the rain showed no sign of letting up. Inspired perhaps by real historical events like the Great Flood of 1867 in nearby tips.They or the relentless storms of 1893 that devastated crops across the South. But this 1897 deluge was legendary, recorded in local diaries as 40 days of ceaseless precipitation that isolated families, caused landslides that buried roads, and forced desperate measures like boiling river water for drinking despite the silt. And through it all, Angus's roof not only stayed dry, but also warm, thanks to the thermal mass of the clay, which absorbed daytime heat even on cloudy days and released it slowly at night, maintaining a steady temperature that allowed his family to sleep comfortably without extra firewood, a luxury when wood piles were sodden and hard to ignite. Neighbors began knocking tentatively, first for advice, then for shelter, as their own roofs failed spectacularly, with one man's shingle top caving in under the weight, flooding his kitchen and destroying heirloom furniture passed down generations. And Angus, ever the gracious soul, shared his knowledge, explaining how the interlocking tiles created a waterproof seal, how the clay's porosity allowed it to breathe without trapping moisture inside, preventing the mold that plagued others, and how this method echoed ancient practices from Mediterranean cultures that colonists had overlooked in favor of quicker, cheaper options. But as the 30th day dawned with skies still weeping, tensions rose, food supplies dwindled, livestock drowned in pastures, and rumors spread of divine punishment, making some wonder if Angus's pagan roof had angered the heavens. Yet he remained calm, tending his hearth. But deep down, he knew the worst was yet to come, and the final revelation would change everything. By the 35th day, the valley resembled a vast, churning lake, with water lapping at cabin doors and folks resorting to makeshift rafts to check on kin, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion from bailing out basements and patching futile holes in roofs that wept like open wounds. But Angus McLoud's home stood as a beacon of resilience, its clay roof unscathed, dry as desert sand inside, and radiating that gentle warmth that kept his wife knitting by the fire and his kids playing games without the constant shiver of damp cold. A stark contrast that finally silenced the doubters and sparked a quiet revolution in how these mountain people thought about building for the future. Historically, this event mirrored broader shifts in American architecture during the Industrial Age, when innovations like mass-produced clay tiles began trickling into rural areas via railroads. But Angus was ahead of his time, adapting local materials to create what we'd now call sustainable design, using the Earth's own bounty to combat climate extremes that were becoming more frequent due to deforestation and changing weather patterns. And his success highlighted the benefits of clay roof and its fire resistance, longevity spanning centuries if maintained, an eco-friendly nature since it didn't require felling trees, preserving the forests that these settlers depended on for game and timber. Emotionally charged, Angus's triumph wasn't without cost. He faced isolation at first, but his neighbors sought refuge, sharing stories around his warm table. Bonds reformed, stronger, with old Mr. Harlan admitting over stew, "I called you foolish, Angus, but you saved us all with that stubborn head of yours." And soon, folks were begging for lessons on mixing clay, firing tiles, and installing them with overlaps to ensure no water turning what was once mockery into admiration that spread through oral histories, influencing later generations to adopt similar techniques in the face of floods like the infamous 1916 deluge that ravaged Asheville nearby. Engaging as these tales are, the real lesson lies in innovation born from necessity. Angus didn't invent clay roofs, but he revived them in a place where they were forgotten, proving that sometimes looking back to ancient wisdom, like the terracotta tiles of Roman villas that endured empires, can solve modern woes. And during those final days of rain, as the 40th dawned with a faint break in the clouds, his cabin became a community hub, where people dried out, mended spirits, and planned rebuilds, all while marveling at how the clay not only repelled water but insulated so effectively, thanks to its high specific heat capacity that stored energy like a battery, a concept Angus intuitively grasped without fancy terms. When the sun finally emerged, revealing the devastation washed-out roads, ruined harvests, homes slumped into Angus's place stood tall, inspiring a wave of clay roof adoptions across the region, cementing his legacy in local lore as the man who outsmarted the storm. And today, remnants of such roofs can still be seen in historic Appalachian structures, a testament to one man's vision. So, if this story of resilience and ingenuity against the odds has hooked you like it did me, hit that like button. Subscribe for more hidden gems from history that show how everyday folks changed the world. And drop a comment below, sharing your own family's tales of beating the elements. Maybe it'll inspire the next video. And remember, sometimes being called foolish is just the prelude to being called a genius.